Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of A Modern Nonprofit Podcast. I am here with my new friend, James Mueller. James has recently written a book, and it's going to talk all about the dysfunctions of nonprofit boards and, more importantly, how to make it more functional. So, James, real quickly, tell us a little bit about your book, the title, maybe where people can find it.
Sure. It's called Onboarding Champions. It is the 7 recruiting principles, if I can just put it up here.
Absolutely.
Onboarding Champions, the 7 recruiting principles of highly effective nonprofit boards. You can find it at Amazon, at Borders. It's on all the libraries for all of the e-publications as well.
Love that. So I love talking about boards, and I found in my experience, I've worked with hundreds, if not maybe thousands at this point, nonprofits over my career. And it seems like the strength of the nonprofit really is driven by the leadership, which in every case includes the board. So I'm excited to
Right.
dive into this topic a little bit more. So first things first, we hear a lot of buzzwords lately about creating boards that are both strong in diversity, equity, and representative of the constituents that they serve, right? Whether it's the
Mhm.
clients or the staffing and those sort of things. So, tell us some of the greatest challenges when it comes to nonprofits and getting to that ideal board, not just from a
Yeah.
skill standpoint, but at all the other demographics that we hope to find.
Yeah. Well, recruitment is an area where most boards are least prepared, or
Hmm.
probably even better said, prepare the least, right?
Hmm.
So when they interviewed about diversity and equity, they often say, well, we don't have any viable diverse applicant pool to pull from.
Hmm.
But I find that the problem lies in really not knowing how to do the right homework to achieve diversity and equity. And so in chapter 5 of my book, I go into this in great detail, but for instance, it's not thinking through the characteristics beyond business acumen. Who do you need on your board? What
Hmm.
competencies? Deliberative thinkers, good communicators, governance experience, people
Hmm.
with governance experience, creativity. I love a sense of humor, character, competence, connections. And so creating that profile of what you're looking for, including the characteristics of diversity and inclusion that you want to include in your profile. But working from a
Hmm.
profile, then you know what you're looking for. But one of the
Hmm.
other barriers is enculturation. We don't connect with those who are different in our culture. We tend,
Hmm.
tend to go
Hmm.
into tribes, right? We may be tribes where people look different, but they have the same values, they have the same perspectives, and they share the same things. So uh, the challenge to boards is to create diversity, is for board members to step outside their comfort zone and to know what they're looking for, and maybe go visit places they don't usually visit, go to lunch at a
Hmm.
place that they don't usually go to lunch in, go to a different part of
Hmm.
town. And so it's really breaking out of our enculturation to connect to others that may not be at the same place as we are day to day.
I love that. And I would take that a step further too, not just from, it's one of the things that I've learned is not just from a board recruiting standpoint, but also staff recruiting, right? So go to
Right,
places that you may not have historically gone to, right?
right. Yeah,
So let's talk. I kind of hinted on it a little bit, but let's talk about some dysfunctional boards
yeah.
and the impact in your experience. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you've seen dysfunctional boards impact the good work that a nonprofit's been doing, especially those maybe that have a long history or short history. Either way, tell
Yeah.
us some of those experiences that you've had.
I have so many war stories, and I try to tell a number of them in the book, but it happens often. And most often, it's not understanding the responsibilities of governance, or not
Hmm.
paying attention, or not being invested, or sometimes stepping across the line into management. It's really
Hmm.
the lack. I don't think there's a lot of access to what is a great board member. I don't think
Hmm.
nonprofit board member. I don't think there is access to a lot of information out there. So that's one of the reasons for putting the book out there. But to help people understand that board governance is a fiduciary responsibility. And that responsibility is to look out for the greater public's good, right? So,
Hmm.
and that an organization's on track with its mission, that it's effectively serving its constituency, and that it's fiscally responsible. So, another factor for this is that nonprofit marketplace is growing ever more competitive, and boards need to
Hmm.
keep an eye on the future and how the organization will thrive while making an impact on the lives of their constituents. And so if they aren't invested, if they aren't taking time, if they aren't paying attention, those are the common dysfunctions that harm an organization. And COVID was one of the greatest litmus tests to effective
Hmm.
governance we've had. And it really
I
showed the difference between
mhm.
the two types.
I agree. I agree with that. You talked quite a bit about nonprofit boards that, well, I think it's either on one end of the spectrum or the other, right? It's usually they're paying attention, they're involved, arguably over involved, and like you said,
Sometimes.
crossing that line of
Yeah.
management. And I'd
Yeah.
love to talk a little bit more about that. I know that
Yeah.
that's an area for most people,
Right.
and really kind of a distinction. And we're going to talk, which I think kind of dovetails into my next question for you, around the CEO role and the
Right.
difference between a CEO role and the board role. Because I found that in my
Yes.
experience, a board member is usually, or a collective board, so a board member, it's either one extreme or the other. They're overly involved or they're not involved in.
Yeah.
So let's
Yeah.
talk about the CEO role, because I think this dovetails nicely into this, right?
Yeah.
So the board and CEO relationship is a
Mhm.
game changer for most nonprofits, and
It-
sometimes you can
mhm.
see that go sour because of those issues, right? So could
Right.
you talk just a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. It starts with dysfunctional recruitment. So
Mhm.
I find that most boards over the 40 years I've been involved in this look for board members who are at arm's reach away and whom they're comfortable with, right? And so
Mhm.
that boards often look for business acumen. Well, if you don't recruit for governance competence, but are recruiting for business acumen, you are inviting managers to serve on the board. And so right there is
Mm,
the first problem with it, because that's what they know how to do. And if they're
yeah.
not educated about what governance is and where that line is, it causes all sorts of trouble. And I see it numerous times. So here are some of the
Mhm.
principles I take. The CEO is not subordinate to the board. The
Mm,
CEO does not report to the board chair. The
mm,
CEO is the executive responsible for effective management, and the CEO is accountable to the board as a corporate unit. So it's the
mhm.
board's responsibility to hold the CEO, who is an executive and director, right? Executive director, is to ask them good questions, even challenge the CEO at times, and to be ever watchful for impropriety, absolutely. But the boards need to learn how to work collaboratively and supportive in a supportive partnership with the CEO. As one of my good friends says, he says that the board is the big what, the
Mhm.
management is how, and that's where you
Mhm.
draw the line.
I love that, because I've heard that so many times, that the boss of the CEO is the board chair. And I love how you challenge that. And I also love how you mentioned that we tend to find, I think, executives, I see this all the time, right? A board is made up of executives and leaders and managers within a number of different businesses, and they're used to managing, and they carry that same thought
Yeah,
process. Because I see
yeah.
one nonprofit I was working with recently, every check over $250, the CEO has to
Don't.
get approval. I
Yeah.
know. I mean, we can go on and on with the
Yeah.
stories, and it's like,
Yes,
and
there are
and I've
many.
personally
Yeah.
struggled a little bit with, in my role as an outsourced accounting firm, where the CEO doesn't want to deal with any of the accounting. So I have to deal with the
Oh,
finance committee directly for all of the
yeah.
basic things like getting checks
Right.
signed, and I find this oftentimes in faith-based communities, frankly,
Yeah.
even though they might have a board, but oftentimes a lot of administrative functions that you think a CEO
Yes.
or a lead pastor would be responsible for are often delegated to a committee, which
Yeah.
is the board. And then you've just set yourself up for some struggles there.
Trouble. Yeah,
Anyway, lots of
absolutely.
stories we could
Yes,
go
there are
into.
lots of stories out there.
So speaking of that, if we don't want to head that way, obviously solid, productive, effective boards don't just happen by chance. I say that with clients too. Good clients are trained to be good
Right.
clients, and bad clients are trained to be bad clients. So how do we set up a board that is, that is solid? Tell us a little bit more about what we need to do
Sure.
on the
Sure.
recruitment side, and maybe the training and some of those other components.
Yeah, I take a step back a little further and say it's culture. And
Mm-hmm.
culture to me is the unspoken assumptions about how people should think, feel, and act, and the behaviors that result from those assumptions. So
Mm-hmm.
the research is quite clear that if you identify, promote, and stay true to your core values, you can create an intentional culture, right? That
Mm-hmm.
that thrives. So it's character, its intentions, its commitment to play a big part in establishing the right culture. So that's how I
Mm-hmm.
think you get there. It's in your
Mm-hmm.
recruitment process, and really how you set the tone and the stage for an effective board.
Love that. Love that. So, we talked about, culture, and what about what were some of the practical ways that you can introduce that culture into the ongoing board function, I guess, if you will? So
Yeah.
specifically, I guess we're talking about,
Mhm.
what have you seen nonprofits that are successful? Hey, we're going to overhaul this whole process. We're going to invite some new board members into the mix. What are some of the steps that you've seen to
Yeah.
establish that culture and starting on the right foot? If we're going to, let's just change the way we've done things moving
Right.
forward.
Yeah, I've worked with a number of organizations where we've transformed the culture, transformed the organization, reorganized the organization. And it always starts with what I mentioned is core values. But I explain what core values are. Core values are the beliefs, the principles, and tenets that call you to do your work. In other words, at some point when the organization was founded, someone said that shouldn't be. The world shouldn't be this way, but the marketplace doesn't support it. It should be different. So what caused that poor person to say, we've got to do something about it? What were those core values? So we talk about those core values. And I had an instance with a national membership organization where during the pre-interviews with the board members, many of them said, we have a terrible culture. We treat one another terribly. When I'm speaking, I get spoken over. I get treated rudely, et cetera. So when we went through what their culture is, we started right there. What are your core values? And so when we talked about the core values, I put up the slide with all of the comments from the board members, and the room went silent. Right. And they realized that they were experiencing this cognitive dissonance. They said they were doing X, but they were acting Y. So their real culture was not what they'd hoped it to be. So by simply starting with those core values, you can transform the way a board acts and treats one another. And I also recommend creating a team charter. How do we interact with one another? How do we talk to one another? How do we act in the room? What is our behavior? And making that explicit at the beginning really helps, and pasting it on the wall at every board meeting.
Sometimes not just seeing it or hearing it, but seeing it makes a big difference. Absolutely.
Yeah, you have to talk about it for it to bring about change in behavior.
So, some of those that are listening might think, I've had these issues with the board members. There's a few that I need to get rid of, or there's just the trouble board members that kind of create a little bit of the poison in the water for the rest of the board members. And I've seen cases like this.
Yeah.
So say you're a CEO or a fellow board member and you have a situation where you need to confront some other board members that are doing this role, maybe not in the best interest of the organization or their own agenda or something like that. How would you handle dealing with these sorts of board members that are becoming essentially dead weight or disruptions to the operations?
This is the trickiest and most sensitive subject that has to be addressed, and most boards are ill prepared to deal with it. And so they'll just let this dead weight or this burden carry on. So I was just speaking with a board member this morning for one of my clients. I asked her, what did she expect from her colleagues on the board? And she said, and I'll quote her, transparency, communication, character, authenticity, integrity. She said, keeping the main thing the main thing. I don't want to serve with people who are there for their own self-interest. And the thing is it's not hidden. People notice self-interest of the people and how it's a burden to the board. They look around the table and see who's sitting there and what they're contributing. So it's really the board chair's responsibility to make that call. And I've had to make that call when I was a board chair because we had people who weren't contributing. And so you might say something if you're a board chair, we have a lot to accomplish this year and we need everybody engaged and committed, right? So we understand that you may have personal or business obligations that are taking up your time, or you might address the specific problem if it's not that they're not paying attention, that they're being disruptive. You might talk about what the culture is. And you go on to say, maybe now is not the right time for you to serve on the board. And that's a tough conversation to have, but board chairs need to have it. Now, since most of them won't have it, there are two other things to do. One is definitely have term limits, because at least you have an end to the pain, right? So the cycle of pain will come to an end at some point. And the other is to create this board charter, as I said, and create policies of what it means to be a board member. What is your contract as a board member in terms of how you will be engaged? And that those that don't abide by the agreement have to have a conversation, and it should be with the board chair about their service.
I love that. So, James, you've given so much good advice here today, and I know that there are some other fantastic stories, some real, probably some real life examples. We'll change names and places and dates to protect those in the
Right.
book, but the stories. But really, your book is less on kind of a how-to guide, but it's more of, specific examples, conceptual frameworks, stories,
Right.
concepts that will help guide a nonprofit executive or nonprofit board members, frankly, on how
Right.
to best function as a board. So, again, we could find your book on Amazon. And certainly, if people want to get in touch with you, though, specifically, you want to talk more about maybe your work on
Sure.
the board or with board members, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Well, through my website, which is J Mueller Associates. That's my first name, initial J, then Mueller Associates.com, or jmueller at jmuellerassociates.com. This is the best way to reach me because our
Okay.
website's right out there for people to look at.
Sounds great. Well, I'll go ahead and put that in the show notes for anybody that's looking for it. James, thank you so much for being on this call. It's been great. And I'm looking forward to sharing the book with the rest of the audience.
Well, great. Thank you so much.
Thanks.